Hey y'all. So we are starting a new a new lecture and it's going to be about Bourbon France. And when we look at Bourbon France, we're looking at the idea of French absolutism, right? We're looking at French absolutism from 1589 to 1715. And that's going to cover three reigns. It's going to cover the reign of Henry IV, that we probably will just barely mention. Louis the 13th, which really Louis the 13th's most of his significant work is done through Cardinal Richelieu. And then we're going to look at the concept of the age of Louis the 14th. And most people have heard of Louis the 14th. He is the most significant monarch, probably in European history. And we're going to see how that plays out. So let's go ahead and get started with our conversation here. Can we see that? Boom. Before we get to the development of the bourbons, let's just talk about what absolutism is. Here, when we think of absolutism in general, is the belief that the only way a state can gain stability is by using an absolute monarch who has established a dynasty. So this is the idea that the absolute monarchy shares power with no one. From this view, the king bestows liberties and can retrieve them. The king is paternalistic, very similar to a parent view, right? Paternalistic. It doesn't. This type of government doesn't trust the people. This kind of reminds me, if we had talked a little bit about Thomas Hobbes already, and how Thomas Hobbes believed that the government needed to be an absolute monarch so that there was a sense of stability. Well, that's the kind of belief system that we see here. Well, what justifies such a philosophy? How are people going to believe it? Is it good enough just for the king to say I am, or is there needs to be justification? Well, in France, there's two significant philosophers who developed what we know as Bourbon absolutism. The first predates him by probably about 60 or 70 years before the Bourbons, and his name's Jean Bodin. Jean Bodin is the first real modern French philosopher, and he was writing during the French Wars of Religion. That's going to be during the Reformation. He has seen the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre, and he's like, what's going on here? How do you think he viewed liberty and the role of government? Well, this is a really important element because he wrote his understanding in what we call the Six Books of the Commonwealth. And in the Sixth Book of the Commonwealth, he, as a French humanist, did a deep dive in all of the different types of governments. And he concluded that the sovereign alone, because in all of the mix and all of the chaos, he realized that there needs to be a sovereign, the king, and that king can bring a sense of stability. And that sovereign created the law. He alone creates laws. But since he creates the laws, he's above the law. So the sovereign, if needs to be arbitrary or without reason, he can do that because his goal is to bring stability. So he creates law for the people of his country, but that law does not limit him. He is the absolute power. There is no authority outside of him. He alone can centralize the state. But in doing so, this is where the French Wars of Religion really comes in. Even though he's a French humanist, he believes in humanism, not necessarily religion in that sense. He realized what he drew a conclusion is France had too much liberty. And that too much liberty allowed for the Huguenots to exist. And by having the Huguenots and the Catholics, two religions, he drew a conclusion that that's what created chaos. There's too much liberty. The sovereign alone must adopt one religion, and everyone must conform. And in that sense, there's a sense of stability. So I do want to make that. I'm going to repeat this. The Six Books of the Commonwealth. They were written at the time of the French Wars of Religion. He sees chaos. He begins to feel that too much liberty has been given out. The government must consolidate. And that's when he draws us the idea the sovereign or the king are these elements. And I think it's really significant. And just to look at some of the quotes here, he says, if justice is the end of law law the work of the prince, and the prince in the image of God. Then by reasoning, the law of the prince must be modeled at the law. So we begin to see that though he's a humanist, he's definitely seeing this element that the prince must model the law out of the law of God. So there is a religious element. And he wrote that in a book called On Sovereignty. And here he talks about in democracy, sovereignty is vested in the majority, and a majority is not only at best an ignorant, foolish, and emotional mob, but shifts continually and alters from year to year. So Jean Bodin, he doesn't support the idea of democracy. As he studied in ancient Greece, he drew a conclusion that in the end, that's not the right type. What's best? Absolutism. Well, that book now is established, and we see this idea, the conclusion here. Really important that you read that. But I just want to point out now we have the foundation of French absolutism. But as we evolve into the Bourbon era, now they're going to develop this thing. They're going to develop the divine right of the monarchy, the divine right of the monarchy, and this really becomes part of the overall belief system of French. I want to point out that this actually they're going to lean into not just Jean Bodin but also James the First with the true law of the free monarchies. And who created this concept, this permanent philosophy? Well, it's going to be Bishop Bossuet, and he published a book called Politics Drawn from the Very Word of Scripture. And he is living at the time of Louis XIV. He actually is a tutor or a teacher of Louis XIV. And as he's doing that, part of his job was to create a new philosophy. And he's going to expand. He's going to borrow on Bodin as well as James, but he's going to use the Bible to justify the king's power. Where Bodin was looking at it much more from maybe a secular point of view, establishing the principles of governing through that, Bishop Bossuet he's going to put this in the concept of Catholicism, the Catholic understanding. And he said if God bestowed the temporal authority or secular authority to the king, it would be sinful to challenge it. So now, once we begin to combine religion and government together, we're no longer talking about secular liberty. We're going to start talking about sinfulness. And that has a distinct view, right? It's different than some of the other elements. When we look at some of the Bishop Bossuet's quotes, we see the power of God makes itself felt in a moment from one extremity of earth to another. Royal powers work at the same time throughout all the realm. It holds all the realm in position as God holds the earth. Should God withdraw his hand, the earth would fall to pieces. Should a king's authority cease, all would be in confusion. So think about this. So he's coming around. Yes, God is holding the universe together, but who has God chosen to hold this world, the life that we have? And it's the king. And I think that last part, all would be confusion. And then over here, he begs the king. So kings, exercise your power, then boldly, for it is divine and salutary for humankind. And exercise it with humility. You are endowed with it from without being bred from God. At the bottom of it, it leaves you feeble. It leaves you mortal. It leaves you sinners. And charge you before God with a very, very heavy account. And this is an important element because despite him talking about the idea that we as individuals must submit to his authority because of God, here he's also warning the king that he is more accountable to God than you and I. So this kind of balances it out. This is really a heavy book, and from that we see this development of 17th century French absolutism. Bodin's idea on absolutism became the political theology through the work of Bossuet. And again, political theology. So it's a political theory merged with Catholicism to really create a political theology that then justifies the existence of Louis XIV's absolute. So it's a synthesis of political theory and religious thought. And this is where we're going to unfold this as one king, one law, one faith. And if you haven't written much down, I'm hoping you had that quote here: one king, one law, one faith. Especially when we get to Louis the 14th, we're going to remind ourselves of Bishop Vissay that one king, one law, one faith will really be foundational. And we get a flavor of both Bowden and Bousset. Ends the first part of this pretty large lecture, so make sure you can. I'm going to pause it here, but don't forget you have other stuff to do.